This narrative will transport listeners on a leisurely and gentle journey through the mists of time, to ancient Greek mysteries and the legendary lost world of Atlantis. It is suggested to dim the lights, wrap yourself snugly in the soft embrace of a blanket, and allow the day's hustle and bustle to completely subside, dissolving into the approaching silence. You are about to embark on a deep dive into the history of a city whose existence perhaps stretches back millennia. It was a city where residents walked streets now hidden from view, where they watched magnificent sunsets over harbours now resting beneath the endless expanse of ocean waves. On this special evening, listeners will mentally wander through bustling markets, where the air was once rich with the aromas of exotic spices from the farthest corners of the world. They will hear the gentle, soothing splash of fountains in elegant courtyards, where ancient philosophers, deep in thought, once engaged in their timeless debates about the very nature of truth and existence. And so, with the lights dimmed, and perhaps the soft hum of a fan creating an added atmosphere of solitude, this astonishing journey begins. It leads to a place that seems to hover between tangible history and enchanting dream, between fragile memory and boundless imagination. Imagine this scene. Someone walks down a street that no longer exists, in a city whose reality remains a subject of eternal debate. Here the morning light falls on surfaces differently than anywhere else in the world, creating a unique play of shadows and reflections. The cobblestones underfoot feel smooth and warm, polished to a sheen by the countless steps of generations who walked them for hundreds of years. Everywhere, the gentle, calming sound of water echoes, the clear gurgle of fountains, the quiet flow of canals, the distant, rhythmic beat of waves relentlessly crashing against the majestic harbour walls. This is Atlantis before its tragic fall, and in this atmosphere, the wanderer senses what an ordinary Tuesday might have been like in the most extraordinary city that ever existed on the face of the earth. However, what is particularly remarkable about such extraordinary places is that for most of their time, their inhabitants are engaged in perfectly ordinary, everyday affairs. Like all people, they buy fresh bread, repair broken chariot wheels, engage in leisurely conversations about the weather, and ponder what to cook for dinner. The bakery the wanderer passes exudes a wonderful aroma of honey and freshly ground grain, enveloping the entire block. The baker himself, hands dusted with flour and face etched with deep concentration, is likely the third generation of his family tirelessly working on this very corner. His simple yet noble task is to feed his neighbours. The bread baked here is noticeably different from the usual. It is darker, denser, with the addition of special seeds that give it a unique nutty flavour. The master shapes each loaf by hand, precisely following traditions taught to him by his grandfather, who, in turn, was taught by his great-grandfather centuries ago. The wanderer notices how the surrounding buildings rise in smooth, organic curves. Their walls, built of pale stone, seem to radiate a soft glow in the morning light. The local architecture adheres to principles that feel both incredibly ancient and strikingly advanced. Each structure appears to grow naturally from the earth, creating the impression that the city itself is a living being, breathing in unison with the rhythm of the tides. A woman passes by unhurriedly, carefully carrying a basket filled with fresh vegetables from the market. Her tunic, simple in cut but skillfully woven, is dyed in shades that wonderfully capture the precise, delicate colour of sea foam. She nods politely as she passes, as is customary in small, close-knit communities where everyone knows everyone, even though this city stretches far beyond the horizon, astonishing in its scale. Ahead, the market square pulses with a soft yet powerful energy of continuous commerce. Merchants from the most distant lands offer their wares. Their majestic ships are moored in harbours designed to receive vessels from all known corners of the world. Dozens of different languages merge into a single clamour in the air. Traders from Egypt eagerly discuss the purity and quality of gold, while sailors from distant northern islands meticulously compare the merits of various types of amber. However, what is most striking is the pervasive sense of peace and tranquility. No guards march through the streets. There are no signs of conflict or tension. The people of Atlantis, it seems, managed to create something truly remarkable. A society where trade flourished freely, where different cultures met and harmoniously mingled without friction, and where artistic, philosophical and practical pursuits, rather than military ambitions, were paramount. The wanderer pauses at a majestic fountain in the heart of the square. Water streams from an intricately carved stone figure not depicting a deity, but simply the ocean itself. Stylized waves, carved from solid stone, appear alive, in constant motion. The water, clean and cool, is supplied by a complex engineering system that could rival any structures built by the Romans centuries later. Nearby, children play by the fountain. Their games include creating intricate patterns in the sand and solving mathematical puzzles that might stump even adults from other civilizations. Education in Atlantis begins at the earliest age and continues throughout life. The Atlanteans, it seems, understood a profound truth. Society becomes immensely stronger when each of its members can think clearly, approach problems creatively, and deeply understand the world around them. On one of the benches, an old man sits unhurriedly, skillfully carving figures from whimsical pieces of driftwood. His hands move slowly but with astonishing confidence, and it soon becomes clear that he is not just creating toys or decorations. He is carving educational aids, small yet meticulously designed sculptures that help children grasp the fundamentals of geometry, astronomy, and natural sciences. In Atlantis, even leisure had its purpose, though that purpose was always gentle, always aimed at personal growth and development, rather than strict control or coercion. The afternoon brings with it entirely different rhythms. Workshops open their doors, releasing the heat from forges and kilns, filling the air with the hum of creation. Artisans, with their characteristic concentration, labor over metals and ceramics, creating both functional, practical items and objects of pure, flawless beauty. There is no sense of rush, no insistent urge to finish everything immediately. Quality, as is known, takes time, and time was a resource Atlantis seemed to possess in abundance. One observes a potter whose hands, with hypnotic certainty, shape pliable clay on a spinning wheel. The vessel slowly emerging under her skilled fingers will ultimately be for storing olive oil or fine wine, yet the artisan treats it as if creating a priceless work of art. And this is no accident, for in Atlantis there was no true distinction between the useful and the beautiful. All creations were meant to serve both purposes simultaneously. As evening approaches, the entire city visibly transforms. Numerous lamps begin to glow in the windows, but these are not the smoky, flickering torches one might expect in that era. The Atlanteans had developed a unique system for burning special oils, producing a clean, steady and soft light. The streets remained safely illuminated, yet the lighting was neither harsh nor obtrusive, creating an atmosphere of comfort and tranquility. Families, having finished their day's work, gather for dinner on spacious rooftop terraces offering breathtaking views of the bustling harbour. The food, though simple, is wonderfully varied. Fresh fish, vegetables grown in carefully tended gardens using sophisticated irrigation systems, and fruits painstakingly cultivated to thrive in this unique climate. Meals here are not merely sustenance but long, pleasant social occasions where lively conversation is valued as much as the food itself. One can hear enchanting music emanating from different parts of the city. These are not merely performances, but rather a natural manifestation of a deeply ingrained culture where people were taught from an early age to appreciate rhythm, melody, and harmony. A young man intently tunes a stringed instrument, while his sister practices scales on a wind instrument that produces sounds remarkably similar to the gentle whisper of an ocean breeze. Even at night, the harbour never completely sleeps. Majestic ships, like ghosts, arrive with the evening tide, delivering valuable goods, fresh news, and numerous travellers from across the known world. The mooring process is remarkably smooth and efficient, skillfully managed by harbour masters who have transformed the complex task of loading and unloading ships into something resembling a polished, graceful dance. Night in Atlantis feels entirely different from night anywhere else in the world. The city does not lie dormant. It transforms, acquiring a new, deeper meaning. The daytime energy of commerce and industry gives way to an atmosphere of contemplation, deep study, and a quiet, peaceful celebration of being. Libraries remain open, their spacious reading rooms filled with scholars engrossed in seeking answers to questions that irresistibly captivate their minds. Observatories tirelessly tracked the movements of stars and planets, adding to invaluable knowledge that would later influence navigation, agricultural development, and precise timekeeping. Walking through the residential quarters, one might see families engaged in activities that would appear both familiar and surprisingly strange. Parents diligently help their children with studies that encompass not only mathematics and natural philosophy, but also what we might call social sciences in the modern world. However, they also dedicate significant time to music, physical training, and the acquisition of practical skills, such as cooking and basic engineering, ensuring the holistic development of every member of society. The disparities between rich and poor in Atlantis, though they existed, were far less pronounced than in most other civilizations. Prosperity here, it seemed, was distributed far more equitably, perhaps because the Atlanteans had grasped something fundamental about economics that later societies would, unfortunately, forget. The true strength of a society lies in every member having enough for a dignified life. When no one falls into despair, when talents can flourish unimpeded, regardless of birth circumstances, then true greatness is achieved. Before drifting off to sleep, the listener might ponder the minute details that made this daily life so harmonious and possible. How was their system of governance organized? How did they manage crime, conflict, and the inevitable disagreements that arise when people live together? How did they manage to achieve such abundance without harming the environment that nourished and sustained them? These questions have undoubtedly troubled philosophers and historians for millennia. However, lying here in the quiet darkness, perhaps the most important question is simpler. What would it be like to live in a place where ordinary life itself became a kind of art form, where the daily routines of existence were honed by generations to a state approaching perfection? And perhaps as one drifts off to sleep, the most unsettling question might inadvertently arise. What disrupted this seemingly immutable yet fragile balance? What forces could be so powerful as to end a civilization that seemed to have solved so many problems still challenging the modern world? However, in the very peaceful city where the wanderer had just mentally strolled, where bakers diligently kneaded dough for bread, and children laughed, playing complex mathematical games in the sun-drenched square, something ominous was beginning, something no one had yet fully grasped. The signs were subtle at first, so faint that they could be noticed but not properly heeded, not understood as impending doom. It was like sensing a slight, barely perceptible change in atmospheric pressure, foreshadowing the imminent arrival of a destructive storm, capable of changing the world forever. Early morning on that day promised nothing unusual. The harbour master, following long-standing tradition, made his daily rounds, carefully checking the tide charts. These tables, invariably accurate for generations, suddenly showed a water level that only slightly exceeded what was expected. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough to make him pause and recheck his measurements. In the fertile agricultural lands stretching beyond the city walls, farmers observed with concern that some of their irrigation canals had begun to clog. The complex network of waterways, faithfully serving them for centuries, showed inexplicable malfunctions. Wells, always providing clear, cool water, now filled with murky liquid, and springs emerging from the ground now yielded water with an unfamiliar taste, more saline with an unusual mineral note, unlike anything before. It was the scholars, engrossed in their vast libraries, who first began to grasp the connection between these small but strange phenomena. Atlantean civilization had always been characterized by its attention to patterns, its drive to identify links between seemingly disparate events. They possessed the finest instruments for measuring water levels, sophisticated devices for detecting the slightest changes in the Earth's crustal stability, and proven methods for monitoring the behavior of underground springs and vast aquifers. One could imagine oneself in one of these reading rooms surrounded by countless scrolls and clay tablets, holding centuries of meticulous observations. An elderly keeper of knowledge, bent over a table, spread out maps charting 200-year-old tidal patterns. Her finger slowly traced lines showing subtle but relentless changes accumulating over decades. The true state of affairs with Atlantis turned out to be both more complex and simpler than the dramatic tales that would be passed down by subsequent civilizations. There was no single catastrophic day when the earth opened up and swallowed the city. Instead, a slow, gradual process unfolded, one that might have stretched over many months or even years. The island on which Atlantis stood had always been geologically active. The very deep-seated forces that once shaped natural harbours, created the hot springs that warmed their homes, and formed the rich mineral deposits that fueled their metallurgy, were now subtly but inexorably eroding the very foundations of their world. Imagine walking through this city. As residents began to realize what was happening, the atmosphere was not one of panic. Rather, it was a state of focused preparation. The Atlanteans had always been a pragmatic people, and they set about developing concrete strategies to respond to a situation which, though beyond their power to stop, was still within their capacity to manage. Ships in the harbour began to be loaded differently. Now they carried not trade goods but passengers, valuable documents, and items necessary for founding new settlements elsewhere. The loading process was methodical, almost routinely, as if the Atlanteans had foreseen such an outcome and knew exactly what to do. Families gathered to make difficult decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. One can imagine these conversations. They were practical, emotional, but devoid of despair. These were people who understood that civilizations rise and fall, that the truly important things, knowledge, relationships, values, could be carried forward, unlike buildings and monuments. Craftsmen and artisans worked with a new, yet not desperate, urgency. Their goal was not to save their own workshops. Instead, they focused on teaching their crafts to young people who would carry these skills to new lands. The potter, whose work one might have observed the day before, now dedicated time to apprentices, showing them not only how to shape clay, but also how to find good raw material deposits, how to build kilns, and how to create glazes from available materials. The water level continued to rise, but so gradually that each day seemed almost normal. The ground floors of buildings first became damp, then flooded. But people simply moved to higher levels and continued their daily lives. Markets relocated to elevated areas. The harbour had to be continuously dredged to maintain its functionality, but ships still arrived and departed. What was particularly remarkable during this period was how the social structure of Atlantis was maintained, even as its physical embodiment crumbled. There was no breakdown of law and order, no hoarding of resources, no abandonment of the elderly or infirm. On the contrary, the community became more cohesive as people realized they would have to rely on each other in new ways. Children continued to attend schools, but their lessons now included new, vital skills: navigation, boat handling, identifying plants and animals that could provide food and medicine in unfamiliar environments. The education system adapted to prepare the next generation for a life that would be significantly different from what their parents had known. The religious and philosophical leaders of Atlantis dedicated their time to helping people make sense of what was happening on an emotional and spiritual level. They spoke of cycles of growth and change, about the impermanence of all material things, and that endings could also be new beginnings. As the weeks passed, the evacuation became increasingly systematic. Groups of families boarded ships bound for various destinations, some to already existing colonies, others to uncharted lands where they would start anew. Each departure was seen as both a celebration and a farewell, marked by ceremonies that honored both what was being left behind and what could be created in new places. The final phase was surprisingly peaceful. The last inhabitants of Atlantis were mostly elderly people who had voluntarily stayed to maintain essential services until the very end, along with a group of scholars and priests whose mission was to preserve and protect crucial knowledge and cultural treasures. One can imagine them working by lamplight in buildings where the ground floors were already submerged, carefully wrapping scrolls and tablets, selecting the most valuable items for loading onto the last ships. Their work was methodical, almost meditative, as if they were performing a sacred duty that was more important than their own survival. The inundation itself, when it finally occurred, was less a catastrophe than a gradual descent into slumber. Buildings did not collapse dramatically. They simply sank slowly beneath the waves, which rose steadily, relentlessly, but without violence. The Atlanteans who witnessed this end later described it as a strangely beautiful sight, as if their city was transforming into something new, rather than simply being destroyed. The water that swallowed Atlantis was warm and clear. Fish swam freely through the windows of buildings where families had lived for generations. Gardens became underwater forests, where marine plants now grew among the carefully tended roses and fruit trees that had once nourished the populace. The last ship to depart carried the final group of evacuees, along with the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved much and then accepted its end with dignity and grace. As they sailed away, the passengers could see the tops of the tallest towers, still rising above the water, like islands in an archipelago, marking the boundaries of what had once been the greatest city in the world. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you will think of those last ships and their passengers, sailing towards unknown shores with all they could salvage from their lost homeland. What did they carry with them, beyond their possessions? What stories did they tell their children about a place they could never return to? And perhaps you will dream of those underwater ruins, where fish now swim through the same courtyards where you might imagine yourself walking, where the fountains that once poured fresh water now merge with the endless currents of the sea. Centuries after the last ships sailed from the sinking spires of Atlantis, an old Greek sat in a shaded courtyard in Athens, trying to recall the precise words of a story that had reshaped his understanding of the world. His name was Solon, and he was renowned as one of the wisest men of Hellas, a lawgiver and philosopher who had travelled widely and accumulated vast knowledge. However, this particular story did not come to him from his own wanderings among the Greek islands or his negotiations with foreign kings. It was recounted to him by Egyptian priests, keepers of knowledge that was already ancient when Greek civilization was just beginning, still finding its way in the world. Imagine Solon as a much younger man, perhaps in his 60s, which was considered quite old in his era, walking through the temple complex in Sais, Egypt. The morning was warm but not yet hot, and the shadows of the majestic columns offered welcome shelter from the sun. He was there as a tourist and a researcher, drawn by reports that Egyptian priests possessed historical records dating back millennia. The priest who met him was even older than Solon, his face etched with wrinkles from decades of study and deep contemplation. His name, if Solon ever knew it, has been lost to history. But his role was undeniable. He was a keeper of memories, a guardian of stories that might otherwise be forgotten. The travellers slowly walked through majestic halls, whose walls were covered with intricate hieroglyphs. These ancient writings recounted the deeds of pharaohs and great floods, of fierce wars and eras of peaceful rule, of the rise and fall of civilizations that flourished long before Greece was more than scattered tribes inhabiting rocky islands and mountainous peninsulas. The priest spoke slowly and deliberately, as if each word he uttered carried significant weight, requiring precise balance. He informed Solon that the Greeks, compared to ancient peoples, were like children when it came to grasping the deep history of the world. The reason lay not in their lack of intellect, but in their failure to master the art of preserving knowledge across centuries. "You Hellenes," the priest said, sitting on a stone bench in a sun-drenched courtyard where palm leaves cast intricate shadows, "you are always starting anew. Should a flood, earthquake, or war occur, your libraries turn to ashes. Your wise men depart, and their wisdom fades with them. You neglect your own past, and believe that the world begins only with your own memories." Solon listened with the patience of a man who had learned that the most valuable lessons often unfold gradually, step by step, rather than arriving as a sudden revelation. He inquired about the records kept by the Egyptians and how they managed to preserve accumulated knowledge for many generations. despite the rise and fall of numerous dynasties. The priest gestured to the surrounding walls, etched with carved symbols that were not merely words, but entire concepts, complex ideas encoded in stone, capable of withstanding the test of millennia. "We carve in stone what others record on papyrus," he explained. "We train several priests to memorize the same stories, and we build our repositories of knowledge underground, where floods cannot reach them, and fires cannot consume them." And then, almost casually, as if sharing a story about yesterday's weather, the priest began to tell Solon about Atlantis. He described it not as a myth or a legend, but as a historical event, something that happened as truly as wars, famines, or the founding of new cities. According to the priest, the history of Atlantis was meticulously documented in Egyptian archives, as Egypt was one of the civilizations that maintained close contact with this island kingdom. Egyptian ships actively traded with Atlantean merchants, and Egyptian scholars deeply studied Atlantean mathematics and engineering. When Atlantis began to sink, some refugees reached the shores of Egypt, bringing with them eyewitness accounts of the catastrophe. Solon asked questions with the caution of an experienced historian. He was interested in the precise dates, the island's location, and the political structure of Atlantean society. The priest answered as accurately as possible, though he admitted that some details had been lost even from Egyptian records. The conversation continued for several days, perhaps even weeks. Each morning Solon returned to the temple, and each morning the priest shared new details about the lost civilization. They discussed not only the dramatic end of Atlantis, but also the structure of the society that existed there, its advanced agriculture, exquisite arts, and a political system that seemed to strike a harmonious balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility. One can imagine Solon diligently taking notes each evening in his dwelling, recording everything he could remember, striving to capture not only the facts, but also the very atmosphere of the story. He aimed to convey the sense of wonder and loss that the priest imbued in his description of a civilization that had achieved so much and then vanished so completely. Eventually, Solon's visit to Egypt concluded, and he returned to Athens, carrying this extraordinary story with him. However, here the narrative takes on a more human and complex character. Solon was by then an elderly man burdened with many responsibilities. He was engrossed in politics, lawmaking, the countless details of daily life in a Greek city-state. The story of Atlantis, however remarkable, became just one of many memories from his travels. Solon began to write down the history of Atlantis, intending to create a proper historical account, perhaps even a poem, that would preserve this tale for future generations. But the work progressed slowly. The demands of daily life were constant and pressing, and the project remained unfinished when Solon passed away. The unfinished manuscript passed from Solon's family to his friends, then to their friends. For several generations it existed as one of those things that intellectual families carefully preserve in their libraries. It was an interesting, potentially valuable record, but never urgent enough to complete, until it came into the hands of a young man named Plato, who was Solon's great-grandnephew, or perhaps his great-great-grandnephew. The exact kinship was lost over time, but the intellectual connection remained clear. Plato was already becoming a renowned philosopher, a student of Socrates, a thinker deeply interested in questions of the ideal society and the Best ways for people to live together. One can imagine Plato in his academy, the school he founded in an olive grove outside Athens. He was already middle-aged, experienced enough to be confident in his ideas, yet still young enough to be enthusiastic about new possibilities. The morning light filtered through the leaves as he read Solon's notes on Atlantis, seeing in this ancient story something that deeply resonated with his own philosophical inquiries. Plato was fascinated by Atlantis not only for the dramatic story of its demise, but also for the detailed description of the society that existed there before the catastrophe. Here was a civilization that seemed to have achieved many of the things Plato considered essential for human happiness: prosperity without inequality, government without corruption, education that developed both practical skills and moral wisdom. However, Plato was too distinguished a philosopher to merely retell Solon's narrative without profound reflection. He saw in the story of Atlantis an opportunity to explore questions that concerned him. What makes a society just? How can political power be wisely exercised? Why do civilizations that achieve greatness sometimes destroy themselves? Therefore, when Plato wrote about Atlantis in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, he did something more complex than simply preserving a historical record. He used this story as a way to reflect on political philosophy, on the conditions that allow human societies to flourish, and on the forces that lead to their decline. The Atlantis that appears in Plato's writings is both a historical civilization, about which Solon learned in Egypt, and a philosophical thought experiment about the possibilities and limitations of human society. Plato presents it as a story told by Critias, who claimed to have heard it from his grandfather, who, in turn, heard it from Solon himself. In the quiet of the academy, surrounded by students who had flocked to Athens from across the Greek world to study philosophy, Plato diligently worked on his account of Atlantis. The writing process was slow and meticulous. Every sentence was crafted to serve both historical accuracy and philosophical purpose. But here's what's remarkable. Plato also never finished his account. Critias, which was meant to contain the full history of Atlantis, breaks off mid-sentence, leaving the narrative unfinished for a second time on its journey from an Egyptian temple to a Greek philosophical school. Reflecting on this, one might ponder those unfinished manuscripts, those incomplete stories that somehow retained enough detail to captivate readers for the subsequent 2,000 years. What is it about an unfinished story that makes it more compelling than a complete one? And perhaps, in one's thoughts, this chain of storytellers will emerge. The Egyptian priest, Solon, Plato. Each added something to the story while also omitting something. Each preserved a memory while simultaneously transforming it, until the story of Atlantis became something that belongs as much to imagination as to history. From Plato's unfinished manuscripts and Solon's carefully preserved, fading memories, one can piece together fragmentary glimpses of what Atlantean buildings might have looked like. These were not the dramatic towers and impossible spires later imagined by artists, but something more subtle and remarkable. Their architecture worked with natural forces, not against them. The buildings seemed to grow from the landscape as naturally as trees or mountains. Imagine standing at the edge of what was once the greatest harbour in the ancient world, looking out at a city that ascended in gentle terraces from the water's edge to a central plateau where the most important temples were located. The first thing that would strike you is how different this architecture was from anything seen before. Atlantean buildings were constructed primarily of stone, but not the rough, angular stonework characteristic of many ancient civilizations. Instead, Atlantean builders discovered methods of cutting and shaping stone so precisely that their blocks interlocked without mortar, creating walls that were both incredibly strong and remarkably elegant. The stone itself was unusual. It was a type of volcanic rock, abundant on the island, with a natural color ranging from pale cream to deep gold depending on the light and time of day. When the morning sun illuminated the walls of Atlantean buildings, they seemed to glow with an inner warmth, making the entire city feel alive and welcoming. What truly distinguished Atlantean architecture among other achievements was its profound integration of water into every facet of its design. This civilization perceived water not merely as a utilitarian necessity, but as a fundamental aesthetic, and even spiritual component, possessing the power to transform the very experience of existence within a human-made environment. When surveying the residential districts, one would find that every structure, from the most humble dwelling to the grandest palace, was meticulously planned with water's dynamics and acoustics in mind. Fountains here were not mere decorations or secondary elements. They constituted an integral, vital part of the architectural design, organically incorporated into courtyards, grand entrances, and even rooftop gardens. The engineering solutions required for such deep integration were so perfect and complex that their parallels were not achieved by subsequent civilizations for many centuries. The Atlanteans created a complex system of underground canals and vast reservoirs, ensuring the delivery of clean, fresh water from mountain springs to every corner of the city. However, instead of masking these purely functional systems, they transformed them into an organic component of the visual and sensory perception of the architectural environment. One could imagine walking through a typical Atlantean neighborhood where the ear would catch the constant soothing whisper of water flowing through neatly carved channels along the streets. The eye would notice fountains serving both practical needs and high artistic purposes, and would observe how the architecture itself created unique microclimates, keeping structures cool in hot summers and comfortably warm in winter. The public structures of Atlantis were even more impressive. The Great Library, for example, was conceived as a complex of interconnected courtyards, each incorporating a unique water feature. Here one would find mirror pools creating flawless reflections of the sky, cascading fountains generating a soft white noise ideal for deep concentration, and shallow streams gracefully winding between reading areas, acting as natural, unobtrusive space dividers. The central temple complex stood on the highest point of the island. However, it was not a single monumental structure, like the Parthenon in Athens or the Egyptian pyramids. Instead, it was a collection of more compact buildings, connected by covered galleries with each structure dedicated to specific rituals and meditative practices. The most impressive aspect of these temples was the striking naturalness with which they integrated into the surrounding landscape. Atlantean architects meticulously studied wind and weather. Patterns, the sun's trajectory throughout the day and changing seasons, and the natural drainage systems of the terrain. Their structures did not oppose these natural processes, but harmoniously complemented and enhanced them. The most majestic temple was dedicated not to a specific deity or pantheon, but to the ocean itself, the powerful element that embraced their island, provided prosperity through maritime trade, regulated the climate, and supplied food. This sacred structure was partially built underground, with chambers extending below sea level, so visitors could feel the deep sound and powerful movement of water coming both from above and below ground, creating a truly unique mystical experience. The acoustic properties of Atlantean architecture were exceptionally sophisticated. The builders possessed a profound understanding of how the configuration and materials of spaces could both amplify and gently dampen sound waves. They skillfully used the placement of openings not only to ensure natural air circulation, but also to achieve specific musical effects. Many structures incorporated wind chimes and various water features that collectively formed subtle, constantly changing soundscapes complementing the overall atmosphere. The construction methods employed in Atlantis were so advanced that they would have remained utterly incomprehensible to subsequent civilizations. The architects of that era developed and mastered unique ways of moving and precisely placing colossal stone blocks, methods that could rival the capabilities of modern construction equipment in their efficiency. However, they achieved such results not through brute physical force, but through ingenious engineering, utilizing complex systems of levers, carefully calculated counterweights, and inclined planes. These technologies allowed relatively small work crews to accomplish truly outstanding feats of construction. What was even more significant was that Atlantean structures were inherently designed for exceptional durability. The builders were well aware of their island's geological activity, its susceptibility to earthquakes and gradual topographical changes. Their architectural approach incorporated a principle of flexibility, joints capable of absorbing seismic tremors, foundations that could settle gradually without compromising structural integrity, and materials that aged and weathered gracefully without losing their strength. The decorative elements of Atlantean buildings were not superficial. They were created by carving directly into the stone, rather than by adding separate ornaments. These intricate carvings typically embodied natural motifs, dynamic waves, graceful marine creatures, and patterns inspired by seashells and coral reefs. Yet the decor always remained subservient to function, serving to enhance the building's purpose rather than to distract from it. Private residences in Atlantis, though on a smaller scale, adhered to similar architectural principles. Even the most humble dwellings featured courtyards adorned with fountains and rooftop gardens that not only served as a source of food, but also delighted the eye with their beauty. Rooms in these homes were carefully oriented to maximize prevailing sea breezes and provide optimal natural lighting. A particularly remarkable and truly captivating aspect of Atlantean architecture was its masterful resolution of the relationship between interior and exterior. Many structures featured walls that, in favorable weather, could completely slide or open, creating spaces that were simultaneously indoor and outdoor. Rooms flowed seamlessly into gardens, and gardens in turn blended harmoniously with natural landscapes, making the boundaries between the man-made environment and the wild wonderfully fluid and flexible. The workshops and industrial complexes of Atlantis were designed with the same meticulous care and attention to detail as the temples or residential homes. For instance, pottery studios were oriented to make the most of the best morning light. Metalworking shops were equipped with sophisticated ventilation systems that efficiently drew smoke and excess heat away from workspaces, while maintaining optimal temperatures for production tasks. Even the harbour facilities strikingly demonstrated the Atlanteans' genius in harmoniously blending practical functionality with aesthetic appeal. Docks were constructed from the same golden stone as the rest of the city's buildings and incorporated integrated systems for loading and unloading cargo, making these processes not only efficient but also visually elegant. Storage facilities were designed with enlarged windows, providing abundant natural light while reliably protecting goods from direct sunlight and precipitation. As the years passed and the island gradually began to sink into the sea, Atlantean architecture revealed yet another testament to its exceptional sophistication. Buildings did not simply decay and collapse as water levels rose. They demonstrated an astonishing capacity for adaptation. Lower levels that became submerged were abandoned and hermetically sealed, while upper floors continued to function fully. The roofs of former structures transformed into new ground levels. The city, in essence, learned to exist in constantly changing conditions, maintaining its key functions, even as its physical form underwent radical transformations. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you might imagine these magnificent structures in their current underwater state, not crumbled and distorted, but somehow mysteriously preserving their beauty, their original proportions, and their interconnections. Fish now swim unimpeded through courtyards where fountains once gurgled. Seaweed grows in window boxes previously filled with herbs and flowers. And perhaps the question arises, what exact secrets of construction mastery and unique design sank to the bottom with these buildings? What invaluable knowledge about living in harmony with powerful natural forces was irrevocably lost when the last architect of Atlantis sailed toward an uncertain future, carrying in memory only fragments of an architectural tradition that was likely never to be fully recreated? The last ships that departed from the sinking spires of Atlantis carried on their boards not only refugees escaping the looming catastrophe. They bore the seeds of future civilizations, fragmentary yet valuable memories of a highly advanced society, and a desperate but resilient hope that somewhere beyond the vast ocean horizon they would find land where they could revive their lives and culture. But what became of these survivors? And where did their long wanderings ultimately lead them? One might imagine being aboard one of these evacuation vessels, overflowing with families who could take only the barest necessities, sailing towards a horizon that promised no clear destination. The ship, undoubtedly, was well built, designed by skilled Atlantean craftsmen who had foreseen that their people might need to embark on a long journey from their homeland. Nevertheless, it was loaded well beyond its calculated capacity. People slept directly on deck, and provisions and water were carefully rationed to last for an indefinitely long journey. The ship's captain was an experienced and seasoned navigator, having traded with distant ports for decades. But even he felt profound uncertainty about the outcome of this voyage. Familiar trade routes led to lands that might prove unable to absorb such a significant number of refugees. Uncharted regions, while alluring with prospects of new settlements, harbored many unknown dangers and difficulties. Among the passengers, one could observe the entire spectrum of Atlantean society, concentrated within the confined space of a single vessel. Here were philosophers pondering the fate of their people, and farmers accustomed to tilling the land, skilled artisans and visionary merchants, elderly individuals holding memories of the golden days of early Atlantean prosperity, and children born into a world that had already irreversibly begun to change. Particularly remarkable about these refugees was how they organized their lives during the long sea passage. Despite extremely cramped living conditions and complete uncertainty about the future, they stubbornly maintained the social structures and educational practices that had once distinguished their civilization. Children continued to learn mathematics, natural sciences, and essential practical skills. Adults formed committees to discuss and plan various scenarios for a possible future, demonstrating an extraordinary resilience of spirit. Some of the ships set a course northward, heading towards the shores of territories that would later become known as Europe. These vessels followed long-established trade routes, aiming to reach harbors where Atlantean merchants were known and welcomed. The survivors who chose this direction often possessed the strongest commercial ties. These were people who genuinely believed in the possibility of rebuilding their lives and prosperity within existing trade networks and relationships. Imagine one of those brave northern expeditions, having traversed the seas, landing on a pristine coast. Here at river mouths and cozy sheltered coves, settlements dating back to the Bronze Age had long been established. Naturally, the local inhabitants initially greeted these strangers with their unseen, complex ships and exotic objects with deep suspicion. However, as time passed, relationships gradually formed, strengthened, and developed between them. The Atlanteans, striving for mutual understanding, offered their invaluable knowledge and skills, and in return asked only for a small portion of land and acceptance into their communities. In these newly formed communities one could observe a striking scene. Atlantean culture began to inextricably intertwine with local, centuries-old traditions. The refugees from Atlantis introduced innovative metalworking techniques, significantly improved agricultural practices, and architectural innovations that local builders wisely adapted to available materials and unique environmental conditions. But this process was reciprocal. The Atlanteans themselves also adopted local customs, learned new languages, and gradually, step by step, integrated into existing social structures, becoming part of this world. Meanwhile, other ships decided to head west, into waters that even the most experienced Atlantean navigators had explored only superficially. These expeditions were more adventurous, their crews composed of individuals who preferred the alluring uncertainty of uncharted lands to the difficulties of integrating into established societies. Their sea voyages were longer and significantly more dangerous, but they promised a unique opportunity to create truly new settlements where Atlantean culture could be preserved in its entirety, without compromise or admixture. The Western expeditions faced a series of challenges that severely tested every aspect of their maritime skill and endurance. Fierce storms mercilessly drove ships far off course. Provisions and water supplies ran out long before the longed-for land appeared on the horizon. Navigation became a complex art of reading the subtlest signs in constantly changing weather conditions, studying ocean currents, and even observing the behavior of marine life. When these brave Western travelers finally reached land, perhaps the shores of distant Africa or even more remote unknown territories, they found environments drastically different from their lost island home. Before them lay dense, impenetrable forests, instead of familiar cultivated terraces, rivers flowing in entirely unfamiliar channels, and climates that demanded entirely new approaches to agriculture, construction, and the organization of daily life. One can only imagine the entire process of establishing these new settlements, the careful, painstaking selection of sites that could offer fresh water, possess defensive advantages, and provided access to necessary resources. The paramount task always remained to secure shelter and, of course, food security. However, even in these extremely difficult conditions, the Atlantean refugees sought to incorporate elements of their traditional architecture and urban planning principles, maintaining a connection to the past. The early years of these settlements were marked by continuous adaptation and tireless experimentation. Crops that grew easily in the fertile soils of Atlantis might not thrive in completely different soils and climatic conditions. Building techniques had to be modified to work with available local materials. social structures evolved to adequately respond to new challenges, while preserving the core cultural values that were sacred to them. Some refugee communities, displaying astonishing resilience and ingenuity, flourished in their new conditions, gradually transforming from temporary camps into permanent towns, and then into magnificent centers that could rival their lost homeland in prosperity and sophistication. These successful settlements became beacons of learning and culture, carefully preserving Atlantean knowledge, while also developing new innovations inspired by their new, unique environment. Other settlements, unfortunately, could not cope with the difficulties of their new situations. Harsh climates, hostile neighboring tribes, or simply the deep psychological trauma of losing their homeland made it extremely difficult for some refugee communities to establish a stable and prosperous new life. These settlements might have lasted only 1 or 2 generations before being completely abandoned or absorbed by larger and more numerous local populations. The fate of Atlantean culture in these scattered settlements represents one of the most intriguing aspects of the survivors' story. In some places, refugees made conscious, titanic efforts to preserve their traditions intact, creating communities that functioned almost as living museums of their lost civilization. Children diligently learned Atlantean songs and legends. Artisans continued to create objects in traditional styles, and scholars tirelessly worked to preserve the written records of their unique culture. In other communities, the process of integration with local populations occurred much more rapidly and intensely. Atlantean refugees actively intermarried with local families, adopted their customs, and gradually witnessed their distinctive culture merge with broader regional tradition. Within a few generations, only certain skills, unique stories, or characteristic artistic motifs might have remained as faint traces of their Atlantean heritage. The most successful refugee settlements were likely those that managed to find an ideal balance between carefully preserving the past and necessary adaptation to the present. These communities maintained their core cultural values and essential knowledge, while also embracing and implementing innovations that helped them thrive in their new, not always hospitable environment. The archaeological evidence of these Atlantean settlements is by its very nature extremely difficult to identify with full certainty. How does one distinguish natural local cultural development from the influence of refugees from a long-lost civilization? However, some scholars believe they can trace Atlantean influence in the sudden appearance of advanced metallurgy, sophisticated agricultural techniques, or distinctive artistic styles in various, seemingly unrelated parts of the ancient world. Perhaps even more importantly, Atlantean refugees may have significantly contributed to the development of maritime cultures throughout the Mediterranean and even beyond. Their advanced navigational skills, innovative shipbuilding methods, and deep knowledge of ocean currents could have had a colossal impact on the expansion of trade networks and the acceleration of cultural exchange between peoples. As these disparate communities developed over many generations, they maintained contact with each other whenever possible. Ships carried not only trade goods but also invaluable news, exciting stories and cultural innovations between distant settlements. Thus, a vast network of Atlantean-influenced communities might have developed, linked by common origin and continuous cultural exchange, creating a kind of invisible empire of knowledge. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might ponder the descendants of those very first refugees. Did their communities survive long enough to influence later great civilizations? Are there certain traces of Atlantean knowledge hidden deep within the traditions of cultures that never knew the name of the lost island? And perhaps you will dream of those refugee fleets sailing into an unknown future, carrying on their boards the seeds of new cultures that were destined to ultimately grow and flourish in ways their passengers could not have imagined, forging unbreakable links between past and future that would shape the development of civilization for millennia to come. Long before the great Plato began to craft his philosophical dialogues recounting Atlantis, and centuries before the Athenian lawgiver Solon embarked on his journey to Egypt to hear ancient tales from wise temple priests, the Hellenes had already forged their own, quite sophisticated traditions for preserving and transmitting cultural memory. An understanding of how these unique narrative traditions functioned allows us to more deeply appreciate both the power and the multifaceted nature of the Atlantis narrative that has reached us through the ages. One might imagine the setting of a spacious hall on one of the Greek islands, perhaps in that distant era when Homer composed his immortal poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, many centuries before Plato's birth. The evening meal has concluded, and the members of the household have gathered around the central hearth, where a fire burns calmly and steadily, casting intricate dancing shadows on the stone walls. An elderly storyteller, a skilled bard whose very existence depended entirely on his unique ability to memorize and masterfully perform lengthy narrative poems, prepared to begin the evening's performance, full of ancient tales. This distinguished bard held in his vast memory not just one or two stories, but dozens of interconnected narratives, which, when woven together, carefully preserved the history, fundamental values, and unique cultural identity of his people. He possessed extensive genealogical knowledge, capable of tracing family lineages back 20 generations. He could recount in minute detail reports of wars that had raged centuries ago, mentioning the names of valiant heroes, describing their weapons and armor, and revealing the complex political relationships that ultimately led to those ancient conflicts.